Hello everyone, so today I'm going to be talking about the neuroscience of humor, the neuroscience of jokes, and what and how and why we find something to be funny, and what are the brain structures involved in these operations. And so my interest in the neuroscience of humor started when I had a course in which I had to study a very classical case study if you study neuroscience, which is the case of patient HM, Henry Molaison. And so patient HM had severe epilepsy, which was mostly focused in medial temporal lobe structures. And so because of that, great part of his hippocampus was removed. And as you might know, the hippocampus plays an important role in memory, although it is important to mention that the hippocampus alone is not responsible for explaining the whole complexity of memory storage. But an experiment they did with patient HM was that although he could not form new memories after a certain time, as he developed intergrade amnesia, they did try something with him, which was they told him a joke and he laughed. He found the joke funny. A little while after, some seconds after that, they told him the joke again. And of course, he did not remember the joke. So it was as if he was hearing it for the first time. But what these researchers found was that as they repeated these iterations of saying the same joke to patient HM, he actually started laughing less. And so this has led some researchers to argue that maybe there is a form of memory encoding in terms of humor perception, in terms of jokes, that is something that is above normal memory pathways. And so with this video, I would like to take a deep dive in this area and discuss what brain mechanisms do we know that are associated with humor. And I will also be essentially talking about how we have different pathology and different lesions that may cause impairments in our ability to perceive and produce humor. In neuroscience, like many other fields, most of the research and most of the findings that we can make come from loss of function studies where there is some impairment in a brain region or an actual lesion there that allows us to understand the actual importance of that same region in functional terms. So one recent work by Ori Amir and Irving Biderman from the University of Southern California has looked at some of these mechanisms that are behind humor perception and production. And so what they found is that the temporal regions are highly involved in the mechanisms of humor. The temporal regions are, of course, very associated to language processes in the brain, so it makes a lot of sense, right? Since humor is mostly semantic, although there are different variations of humor, and I will specify that later on in the video. But what they realized from this study was that people who were more experienced in comedy had higher levels of temporal activation, temporal lobe activation. They also reported that humor and aesthetic perception seem to have some overlap, a significant overlap in terms of the associated brain regions. And so some things that I should say from the start is that the actual mechanisms behind humor perception are actually pretty complex, because humor is actually a higher order cognitive function, because it needs to take into consideration many different aspects. And so there are two main different aspects to humor. So one of them is detecting the joke, so the cognitive part of this function, which is identifying that there is something there. But then there's another part, which is the affective part, which is actually enjoying the joke. Because many times we get a joke, we understand the play of words behind a certain joke, but we don't find that joke to be funny. So here we have two different dimensions that we can use to set up a framework to investigate this topic. Knowing that there are several different processes involved in humor makes sense, because different pathologies that have been observed may differentially impact these different dimensions of humor. So, for instance, the perception of humor and the ability to produce humor. Then we also have many different psychological theories that try to explain the evolutionary role of humor and why it has become such of an important thing for us human beings. One of these theories is the superiority theory of humor, which states that humor has evolved as being something that allows us to express negative feelings in a positive way. So it has an important impact in terms of us gaining emotional flexibility and emotional processing. Other researchers see humor and laughing as a mechanism for tension relief and social bonding. So it is something that becomes more important the more social you become. Then you also have Miller's evolutionary theory, which states that humor can be used as a way to help selection of potential partners. As I mentioned before, humor and some jokes involve some degree a theory of mind, which is our ability to model our minds and the minds of others around us. And so if you have disturbances in terms of theory of mind, then it becomes reasonable to say that you will have some alterations in terms of humor perception and production. This is the case for many individuals who suffer from schizophrenia or have autism. Although since autism is a spectrum disorder, schizophrenia is also a spectrum disorder. So depending on where you are along that spectrum, you will have a different level of impairment in regards to humor perception. Because of how humor alterations seem to also correlate with differences in brain function, some researchers have asked the question of whether we can use neuropsychiatric scales that focus on changes in humor, in normal humor, as a way to detect early signs of neurodegeneration. It is important to say that at this moment we still do not have scales that are precise enough, that are focused on these forms of humor changes in people to assess the onset of neurodegeneration, but this is an area of research which might grow in the future. Going back to the case of schizophrenia, some neuroimaging studies have shown that there is hypoactivation of the frontal, temporal, and limbic cortices in schizophrenia patients in comparison to normal controls. We also need to take such studies with a grain of salt, given how complex and varied these brain structures impact behavior. Other diseases which impact social cognition and humor seem to be, for instance, frontotemporal degeneration, where we can point variants such as semantic dementia and behavioral variants of the frontotemporal dementia. It has also been observed that patients with Parkinson's disorder appear to have some changes in terms of their humor perception, and this might be due to the degeneration of dopaminergic neurons. Pathological humor is also an interesting case to go over. There is a German word for this. Of course, the Germans have words to describe very specific emotions and situations, as many of you may know, and the term Witzelsucht, I'm probably pronouncing this very, very wrong, but Witzelsucht is a term for pathological humor, which consists of someone who has a compulsion to continuously make inappropriate jokes. Probably a lot of you guys watching this video will be saying that maybe you are one of those people, but in this case it really is a compulsion, and normally these jokes are highly inappropriate and repetitive and said at times and durations that are socially incompatible. This is found in some patients with brain tumors, frontotemporal dementia, and with other lesions in the frontotemporal lobe, most specifically the right orbitofrontal region, as well in some developmental genetic disorders, such as the Angelman syndrome or the happy puppet syndrome, Down syndrome, Williams syndrome, and in some forms of autism. Some psychological studies have also reported that there are sex differences in terms of humor appreciation and production, arguing that women prefer absurd and nonsensical humor, while men prefer aggressive and sexual-related humor. Of course, such studies and such observations need to be taken also with a big grain of salt, and we need to ask the question of how generalized these notions are. It is important to mention that this might simply be a case of personality distributions, given how men and women have some differences in personality. It might mean that it's not necessarily something that pertains to sex differences, but more so something that pertains to differences in personality, because as further studies have shown, feminine women tend to prefer this absurd, nonsensical humor, but masculine women tend to prefer the sexual, aggressive humor. And so, as you know, there is a masculine and feminine polarity for each sex. And so, depending on where you are in that spectrum, you can have these differences in appreciation for different humor. But even then, we cannot make a general statement about this being a very solid psychological finding. It has also been reported that damage to the right frontal lobe leads to deficits in humor processing, which affects the ability to appreciate complex humor. For example, verbal semantic jokes, but such deficits seem to spare simple humor. An example of simple humor is, for instance, puns, slapstick humor, physical humor. That seems to not be impacted that much in frontal lesions. It is also important to mention that there are different types of laughter. We can, of course, know it might be possible for us to have no clue about this, but there is a difference between genuine laughing and fake laughing, and these differences in laughing patterns and vocalizations have differences in terms of their interpretation and intentions. And so laughter can indicate and symbolize play behavior and safety. It can also be used as a way to express power differences. So laughter can also be used as a way to assert dominance. There are also social phobias such as Gelotophobia, which consists of someone being afraid of being the target of a certain joke, and this then becomes a pathological situation because the person becomes extremely paranoid or afraid of being the subject of a joke. We also have pathological laughter, in which a person is unable to stop laughing even when there is an absence of an external stimulus, and so the person will just keep laughing without even knowing why he or she is laughing. And such situations do occur sometimes after a stroke or in some neuropsychiatric conditions. And so it seems that from a neuroanatomical perspective, the frontal and the temporal regions seem to be key players in terms of modulating humor behavior. This is not a very surprising finding because, of course, temporal regions and frontal regions have very big implications in terms of social cognition. And so given that humor is greatly a social phenomena, that these two regions would be implicated. Although there are also recent studies that have looked at the impact of subcortical regions, such as the striatum, more specifically the ventral and dorsal striatum, as also being key players in terms of the humor behaviors. The dorsal striatum plays a role in movement and decision-making and cognition, while the ventral striatum seems to be important in terms of rewards and emotion. And so overall, it can be said that humor is a complex neuropsychosocial phenomena, and that there are impairments that range differentially depending on what regions are implicated and affected. And so we know that neuropsychiatric conditions can deeply impact our ability to find and produce something funny. It is also present in the literature that laughter can have a positive impact in our mood by reducing stress hormones such as cortisol. This is, of course, not surprising, since after we laughed or during laughter, we feel some relief and tension, at least when it is genuine. And so my main message here is that laughter isn't simply about finding something funny. It is something that is extremely complex and that has many different functions and roles in our general cognition. And so hopefully you found this video interesting. Let me know if you want me to provide a more detailed video on the neuroscience of humor. And yeah, see you next time.